All right, so we're diving deep into the subtle art of not giving effect today, and I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this one because you picked it. I have to admit, just the title alone, it kind of makes you stop and think.
Yeah, for sure.
So no time wasted, let's jump right into it.
Yeah, let's do it. There's a lot of good stuff there. And what I find fascinating about Manson is that he doesn't beat around the bush. He comes right out and challenges this whole idea that we need to care about everything. In fact, he argues that's like a recipe for misery.
Yeah, he hits us right off the bat with this story about Charles Bukowski, the poet. Now, Bukowski was known for being a bit of a, shall we say, rough around the edges character.
Oh, yeah.
But he owned it. He wrote about his experiences with his brutal honesty, and people loved it. He found success by embracing that loser identity.
And the irony of that is not lost on Manson. He even points out that Bukowski's tombstone reads, "Don't try." It's like this final wink from beyond the grave saying, "Hey, I told you so," you know? Like the takeaway here, the real essence is that true authenticity, embracing your flaws and all that can be so powerful.
It's like that saying, the truth will set you free,
Yeah.
but with like a Bukowski-esque twist to it. And then Manson takes that idea and runs with it. He's suggesting that we're drowning in things that we're told to care about.
Yeah.
And it leads to this thing he calls the feedback loop from hell. Have you ever felt that?
Oh, yeah.
Like, I think we all have at some point.
Definitely. It's that spiral you get into where you start feeling anxious and then you get anxious about being anxious. It's like feeling bad about feeling bad, which just makes you feel worse.
Exactly.
And then Manson argues that social media just throws fuel on that fire.
Oh, yeah.
Because we're just bombarded with these perfectly curated lives.
Right.
It makes it so easy to fall into the trap of comparing ourselves and doubting ourselves.
Well, absolutely.
Yeah.
Like everyone else is living their best life on a highlight reel, and we're stuck with the blooper reel. But Manson's point is, and this is where I think he gets really interesting, is that accepting those negative emotions, those moments when things just suck, is not weakness. He calls it a path to practical enlightenment.
And it's important to note here, he's not talking about some mystical state of bliss where you float above your problems, This is about grounding yourself in the reality that life will throw curveballs.
For sure.
There will be disappointments, there will be failures, heartaches. It's about making peace with that reality and recognizing that it's not a detour, it's part of the journey.
So it's not about avoiding problems altogether, because let's face it, that's impossible.
Right.
Right. It's about choosing the right problems, the ones that are worth struggling for. And he illustrates this with a story about a prince who thinks that if he gives up all his wealth and goes and lives in poverty, that will bring him enlightenment. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. He comes to realize that suffering for suffering's sake isn't the answer.
Exactly. And this is where Manson introduces this character, Disappointment Panda, who I have to say I kind of love.
Okay.
He's this blunt, no-nonsense superhero who tells it like it is. And one of his lines that really stuck with me is, "Don't hope for a life without problems. There's no such thing. Instead, hope for a life full of good problems."
Okay, so that's the thing, right? We often think about happiness as this state of being problem-free.
Right.
But Manson flips that on its head and says, no happiness comes from solving problems.
Yeah.
It's about having something meaningful to strive for, to struggle with. He even talks about how he wanted to be a rock star, but then he realized he didn't actually want to put in the work, the struggle that it would take to get there.
And that's a really profound insight. It's not just about achieving the end goal. It's about finding fulfillment in the process, In the journey itself. Think about it in the context of your own life, What are you willing to struggle for? What problems are you excited to tackle? Those are the pursuits that'll ultimately bring you the most satisfaction.
Yeah, and it's so easy to get caught up in wanting the result without the work,
Right.
As we see that shiny end product, that success story, but not all the grit and the grind that went into it.
Yeah.
And it kind of brings us to another one of Manson's points that I think really hit home for me. This whole idea of the self-worth paradox. He talks about how our culture often equates self-worth with external validation, with achieving these exceptional things.
Yeah, and he contrasts these two really interesting characters to kind of illustrate this point. Jimmy, this entitled startup founder who's all talk and no action, and then Mark, that's Manson himself, who actually struggled with feelings of entitlement in his relationships stemming from a really difficult adolescence. And it's like a really vulnerable admission, and it shows how we can all be susceptible to these patterns, even when they're rooted in our past, our past experiences.
Look, we're always looking for something outside of ourselves to tell us we're good enough or successful enough or worthy enough.
Right.
And Manson argues that technology and media play a huge role in this.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, think about it. We're constantly bombarded with stories of overnight successes, influencers with these seemingly perfect lives, and it's so easy to fall into that trap of comparison.
Oh, yeah.
We start to feel like we need to be more, do more, achieve more, just to keep up.
It's true, and that's where things get really dangerous, because when our self-worth is tied to these external markers of success, we're essentially building our house on a foundation of sand.
Right.
It's always going to be shaky. And to kind of drive this point home, Manson uses this incredible story about Hiru Onoda, the Japanese soldier who continued fighting World War II for 29 years after it ended.
Wait, 29 years?
29 years.
I need to hear about this.
It's wild. This man was so convinced that the war was still going on that he lived in the jungle for almost 3 decades, surviving on his own, even after finding evidence that the war was over. He refused to believe it.
Wow. That's both incredible and a little bit terrifying.
Yeah.
It makes you think about what beliefs we might be holding on to that are outdated or even harmful without even realizing it.
Exactly. And that's where Manson challenges us to examine our own values. And to kind of illustrate this point, he talks about this button experiment, where they basically put people in a room with a button and they have to figure out what it does.
Okay.
And turns out there's no pattern. But people start inventing meaning, attributing significance to these random events.
It's like our brains are hardwired to find those patterns, to create those stories, even when there's nothing there.
Exactly. And this ties into the idea that we often choose our problems by the values that we adopt. So if we believe that our worth is tied to our achievements, we're constantly going to be chasing that next milestone, never really feeling satisfied.
Right.
But if we choose values like authenticity or connection, making a difference, those values will lead us to different, more fulfilling problems to solve.
It's not just about what we think. It's about what we do with those thoughts.
Right.
And that kind of brings us to another really important distinction that Manson makes: responsibility versus fault.
Yes.
And this can be tricky.
Yeah.
He's not saying that we're always to blame for the bad things that happen to us.
Right.
We're not at fault for everything. But we are responsible for how we choose to respond to those events.
That's right.
So it's about taking ownership of our reactions, even when life throws us a curveball.
Mm-hmm.
And he gets really personal here. He shares a story about being cheated on. And he talks about how he could have easily gotten stuck in the blame game, felt sorry for himself. But instead, he made a conscious choice to focus on what he could control, his own happiness.
And that's such an important point, because it's so easy to get caught up in what Manson calls victimhood chic.
Oh, yeah.
This idea that constantly feeling offended or wronged somehow gives us this moral high ground.
Right.
But in reality, that kind of thinking keeps us stuck.
Yeah.
It prevents us from moving forward and creating a better life for ourselves.
It's like we're trading our power for a sense of righteous indignation.
Exactly. And that's where embracing doubt comes in. Manson argues that true growth requires us to be open to the possibility that we might be wrong, that our beliefs might be outdated or limiting. And to illustrate this, he tells this story about a friend of his who was clinging to his party guy persona, even though it was no longer serving him.
Oh, yeah. I think we've all been there, right? Holding on to an identity, a belief, even when it's no longer working for us.
Right.
So how do we break free from that? How do we let go of that old identity?
Well, for Manson, it's about recognizing that our identities are fluid. We're constantly evolving, and that's okay.
Right.
In fact, it's essential for growth. We have the power to define ourselves on our own terms, based on our values and aspirations, not on some outdated script or societal expectation.
It's like we can get so caught up in who we think we're supposed to be that we forget we have the power to choose, to redefine ourselves at any point.
Absolutely. And that choice often starts with setting boundaries, with learning to say no. Now, this might seem like a strange connection, but Manson actually uses the classic tale of Romeo and Juliet to illustrate this point.
Romeo and Juliet, the ultimate love story. What does that have to do with boundaries?
Well, when you really look at it, their relationship is kind of cautionary tale. It's driven by passion and this desire to escape their problems, not to actually confront them head on. They lack healthy boundaries, the ability to say no to each other, even when it's necessary. And, well, we all know how that story ends.
Yeah, not well.
Not well at all.
So in a healthy relationship, then, what does saying no actually look like?
It can be something as simple as saying, you know what, I need some time for myself tonight, even if your partner wants to hang out. Or it could be like setting a boundary with a friend who's constantly relying on you to solve their problems. It's about recognizing that you are not responsible for other people's happiness.
Right.
And that saying no to something you don't want to do is not selfish, it's self-preservation.
And then self-preservation, that ability to honor your own needs and set those limits, can actually lead to deeper, more fulfilling relationships.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that you are worthy of respect and that you deserve to be in relationships where your needs are valued. And this kind of leads us to another one of Manson's seemingly paradoxical ideas. The idea that limiting our options can actually lead to greater satisfaction.
Okay, that sounds a little counterintuitive. Don't we always hear that more options means more freedom, more happiness?
Yeah, that's what we're told. But in reality, having too many choices can be paralyzing. Think about it. How much time do you spend scrolling through endless streaming options, trying to decide what to watch? Or agonizing over which brand of coffee to buy at the store?
Or which book to read?
Exactly. Manson calls this the paradox of choice. We get so caught up in trying to make the perfect decision that we end up feeling overwhelmed and dissatisfied.
So what's the alternative then?
Commitment. Now, I know that word can sound scary to some people.
Yeah.
But Manson argues that true freedom comes from choosing a few things that truly matter to us and committing to them fully. He talks about how he used to be this restless soul, constantly traveling the world, chasing new experiences. But it wasn't until he actually committed to his writing, to his wife, to a specific place to call home, that he really found this deeper sense of purpose and fulfillment.
It's like that saying, you can do anything, but you can't do everything.
Right.
By letting go of the need to keep all of our options open, we create the space for something more meaningful to take root.
Exactly. And that brings us to Manson's final and perhaps most profound point, death as the ultimate context.
Yeah.
He shares this really moving story about his friend Josh, who died at a young age. And it was a real wake-up call for Manson, a stark reminder that our time on this planet is finite.
That must have been incredibly difficult for him.
Oh, yeah.
But also, in a way, incredibly liberating to be faced with the reality of your own mortality.
Absolutely. And Manson connects this to the work of Ernest Becker, who wrote about death terror. This idea that so much of our anxiety stems from our fear of death, from this subconscious desire to leave a mark on the world, you know?
Like we're all trying to cheat death in some way through our achievements, our possessions,
Yeah.
our legacies.
Right. But Manson argues that by actually confronting our mortality, by accepting that our time is limited, we can actually free ourselves from that fear-driven pursuit. And we can start living more fully in the present moment. He ends the book with this really powerful question, inspired by his experience standing on a cliff at the Cape of Good Hope. What is your legacy? How will the world be different and better when you're gone?
Wow. That's a big question. It makes you really think about your impact on the world beyond just your own personal achievements or your possessions.
And that's the point. It's a call to action, not in the traditional sense of achieving some grand goal,
Right.
but in the sense of living a life that's true to your values, a life that makes a difference in those small everyday moments. It's about choosing to give a feck about the things that matter, the things that align with your heart,
Right.
and letting go of the rest.
This is not about being indifferent or apathetic. It's about being intentional. It's about choosing your values and living in alignment with them.
Exactly. And that, I think, is the subtle art of not giving a feck.
You've given us a lot to think about today. So to our listeners, we would love to hear your takeaways from the subtle art of not giving a feck. What resonated with you? What values will you prioritize? And how will you make the world just a little bit brighter with your presence in it? Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.